Hey guys, and welcome to another episode on phonies or non-words in Scrabble. My last video on phonies was a big hit, so thanks so much for all the support on that one, and I hope this one is just as enjoyable. Now, this video is going to feature three top players who are all the masters of the creative phony, and the first one is none other than Matthew Tunnicliffe, who was the star of my previous video on phonies. In this first game, he's playing against top expert Matt Canick, and Matthew doesn't have any ways to win the game here. He's down 4 points, he's got a really clunky rack, and Matt's going to be going out for a lot of points with his K in his O next turn. So while Matthew can't win, he makes a clever play here to save himself some spread, and that is by playing this, I'll say, string of letters, because it's definitely not a word, F-U-C-C-E-L. Now, I spell it out because it's still a hotly debated matter to this day how you pronounce this string of letters. Some people would say fuchel, and some would say fuckle, and there are maybe even some other pronunciations that could be conceivably correct. We'll never really know for sure. In any case, in this position, Matt can't really challenge unless he's 100% sure it's not a word, because if somehow he loses his turn challenging, Matthew will simply play out next turn and win. So Matt allows this to stay on the board and simply plays out with core and ends up winning the game. In this next position, he's playing another strong player in Jason Ubika, and Matthew's in a bad position here. He's down 55 points. He really doesn't have any good valid plays, and instead of making a mediocre valid play, he decides to play Lugaya, L-U-G-A-Y-A, for 38 points in the corner. Now, this is an absolutely ridiculous string of letters here. It doesn't even resemble anything that I can think of that's a valid word, but it kind of puts Jason in a tricky spot, because if you're Jason, you really don't want to challenge this and it somehow come back valid and lose your turn, because all of a sudden now you're only up 17, and if Matthew gets another free turn, then he's going to quickly jump into the lead. On the flip side, if you're Jason, you're still up 17, so you feel like, okay, if I at least let this go, I'll get another turn to cement my lead, and hopefully be able to hold on. And that's exactly what happens. Jason does accept this play and go on to win the game, but Matthew almost certainly saved himself a little spread. In this next position, he's playing another strong expert in Daryl Day, and the position is, again, completely lost. He's got way too many vowels, and Daryl is up 20 points with a strong set of 5 tiles left. So I don't even think this one was a spread saver. It was more just a hilarious play. He makes the play of Tuniki, T-U-N-I-K-I, through the U-N and the K. And this is actually a poor play, even if it were valid, because it gives Daryl an outplay of tripe. So I'm not really sure what Matthew was thinking here. My best theory is that it's a really hilarious word, and it sounds a lot like his name of Tunnicliff, so he just wanted to be able to say that he got Tuniki to stay onto his Scrabble board. That's my best theory, because I'm quite confident he would have seen tripe. Daryl, of course, is perfectly correct to allow this to stay on the board and simply take his 26-point outplay. But in any case, maybe not the best play, but certainly hilarious. And now we're going to move on to another star of the art of phonying, which is the one and only Josh Sokol. I had another video on some of Josh's most ridiculous phonies, and I've got a couple more here. Here he's playing Stefan Fatsis, who's perhaps most famous for being the author of the outstanding book Word Freak on the Scrabble community, which you all should go read if you haven't already. But Stefan is also a very strong player in his own right. In this position, Josh plays the word liatry, L-I-A-T-R-I, which is not a word, and my guess is it is supposed to be confused with liatris, L-I-A-T-R-I-S, which is a valid word. However, it's, I believe, a type of flower, and it's not a plural of liatri by any means. It's simply its own word. However, this play, while a hilarious phony, is actually not the main reason I'm showing this game. There's a play 2 turns later in this position, where it's again Josh's turn, and instead of making a mediocre valid play, he decides he really needs to bingo right now, and he does so by playing Hellboot through this L, which goes unchallenged. Absolutely ridiculous and hilarious play here that, again, doesn't really resemble anything I can think of that's a word, and just doesn't really make sense at all, but somehow he gets this to stay on the board. Now, once again, we have Josh Sokol featured here, and this one isn't so much an intentional phony as just a absolutely hilarious sequence of events. In this position, Josh plays Miow, M-I-O-A-W. And as he hilariously notes in his comments here, he specifically was concentrating to make sure he didn't misspell the valid word of meow, M-I-A-O-W, and he somehow still ends up doing so and plays Miow, M-I-O-A-W. So absolutely ridiculous. And there are many, many valid spellings of meow, but this is not one of them. There's M-I-A-O-W, M-I-A-O-U, M-E-O-U, M-E-O-W, but not this one. However, it gets even more hilarious. His opponent, Shauna, doesn't notice and allows it to stay on the board and immediately bingos back with nubiler for 94 points. Now, nubiler is also not a word, and the crazier thing here is that Josh at first looked at this play and thought Shauna was playing nubiles, N-U-B-I-L-E-S, which he thought was a word. So that's why he didn't challenge. But the ironic thing is nubiles is also not a word. So if Josh had seen nubiler, he would have challenged, but he saw nubiles for some reason on the board and didn't challenge because of that. But the bizarre thing is neither of them are words. So just absolutely a ridiculous sequence of events there all around. Now, in this position, Josh is playing another strong expert in Dean Hergott, and he's in a pretty tough position. He's down 80 or 90 points, and he doesn't really have any good plays here. Or does he? Instead of making a mediocre, like 20-25 point valid play, he makes the ridiculous play of dog shit. And not only does dog shit stay on the board, it scores 96 points, which is quite a lot. Now, I can't help but wonder if part of the reason Dean let this stay on the board was because it gave him a massive bingo of quinine for 123 next turn. It remains to be known whether Dean would have challenged dog shit if it didn't give him this massive bingo back. But in any case, it makes sense for Dean to accept if he's not entirely sure that it's invalid given how many points he's scoring. Josh would actually go on to phony again this turn with moule, M-O-U-L-E. Not as hilarious a phony as dog shit, but still pretty good. However, in the end, Dean would hold on to win the game by a narrow margin despite Josh's phonies. And now we come to our third and final player featured in this video, who is none other than Jackson Smylie. Jackson's another top player, well known for his penchant for playing creative phonies, and this position is no exception. His opponent, Steve, opened with Wud for 14 points, and Jackson's got quite a lot of constants here. He doesn't have any particularly good valid options. He could play Glug through the U for 6 points, or he could exchange, but neither of these options were appealing to him. Instead, he plays Luggit, L-U-G-G-I-T, through the U for 9 points. Now, Luggit, as you may guess, is not a valid word. However, it does do a great job at scoring a few more points and unloading most of the clunky consonants from Jackson's rack. Not only that, but it has the added benefit of setting up a fake S-hook with Luggits, which Jackson of course knows is not valid. Assuming Steve allows Luggit to stay on the board, then Jackson may be able to reasonably assume that Luggits will also stay on the board, so Jackson could conceivably bingo with Luggits later. Also, if Steve tries to put an S on Luggit, Jackson will of course challenge it off the board and get a free turn. Luggits does come into play a few turns later in this position when Jackson's got a strong bingo rack and manages to bingo there with Stifler hooking the S on Luggits as mentioned before. And this is actually far from the end of the phonies in this game. Steve responds with Entrors, which is not a valid word, probably confused with Antrors or Intrors, both of which are valid. Jackson challenges it off and immediately responds with yet another phony, playing Vespa with Stiflers. Now, Vespa, as many folks probably know, is a proper noun. It's a brand that makes motorized scooters and mopeds. However, it is most certainly not valid in Scrabble. And this would stay on the board for Jackson's third phony of the game, and we're still in the very early stages of the game. There were no more phonies played in this game, and Jackson would go on to win. And now we move on to our next position, where Jackson's playing a top player in Michael Fagan, and Michael has just bingoed for 80 points to take a commanding 117-point lead. Jackson does have a valid bingo of Bruited, B-R-U-I-T-E-D, under Dancer, making D-E and A-D. However, instead of that, Jackson bingos with Beautified, B-U-T-Y-F-I-E-D, through the F in Frap. Now, as you may guess, Beautified is very much not a word. However, Jackson felt it was better for him positionally than Brooded because it opens more scoring spots, and considering he'll still be down 40 points, He needs to do that and hope Michael can't really block and that Jackson maybe draws the Q and gets lucky and can score 60 points and get back into the game. Now, this didn't work out for him. Michael simply played Pew, winning easily. However, I think it's a really creative play and just an absolutely ridiculous word. The closest thing I can think of to beautified would be beautified spelled B-E-A-U-T-I-F-I-E-D, so it's a pretty egregious misspelling. Kind of crazy that it stayed on the board, although I can definitely understand Michael's reasoning, given that he had this very strong play of Pew to come back and pretty much guarantee the win. Now, in this next example, Jackson once again finds himself at a large deficit. Here he's down 81 points after his opponent Heather's last play of Pan, and he really doesn't have any good options here. He doesn't want to play off like a U and an R for 10 points or so. He's simply going to be down too many points to make up his deficit. So instead of doing that, Jackson decides to bingo. And how does he bingo, you ask? He plays Gurian, G-H-U-R-R-I-A-N, through the H in Hoer. Now, as you may guess, this is very much not a word, and it's just an absolutely ridiculous phony. I mean, I can't even think of what the closest valid word to this would be. Now, part of the logic with Gurian, I would presume, would be to bait a phony S-hook. If Heather were to put an S on Gurian, Jackson would of course challenge it off. However, Heather does not fall for that trap here. She does accept Gurian, but doesn't put the S on, instead playing Sook in the bottom left. However, Jackson on his next turn fishes off an I, going for an end draw for Amboina, which miraculously, despite Heather's best efforts to block with Lunier, Jackson is able to hit for a four-way overlap and win the game in incredible fashion. So, crazy how he was able to come up with this phony, which didn't directly win him the game, but was able to put himself in a position to fish and then hit his fish to win a game. So, what a crazy victory here for Jackson. And for our final example of this video, we have a game played between none other than two of the stars of this episode, Jackson Smylie and Josh Sokol. The game starts off in very exciting fashion, with Jackson opening with a bingo of Grease Eyes for 108 points. Now, this is a valid word, however, the string of valid words would be extremely short-lived, and in fact it ends right here. For Josh's first turn of the game, he opens with a bingo of fan base, which is not a word. It's a pretty commonly used term, but it is still not valid in Scrabble. However, it gets by Jackson. Jackson plays off some of his vowels with O, and Josh is not done here. Instead of making a valid play, Josh plays Segways, S-E-G-W-A-Y-S, for 106 points, which is also not valid. It's very reminiscent of Vespa, which we saw earlier in the video. A Segway is a type of motorized vehicle very similar to a Vespa, but also it is a proper noun not acceptable in Scrabble. This one also gets by Jackson, so Jackson has allowed 192 points worth of phonies to stay in the first two turns. Amazingly, Josh has scored 192 in 2 turns, which is quite a lot, and 0 of those points came from valid plays, so pretty crazy stuff. A few turns later, Jackson would exact some revenge by playing the word taverned through the E in zoned, which is not valid. However, it's a very plausible phony, and Josh doesn't challenge it off the board. In the end, Josh would go on to win this battle with a very high scoring finish of 541 to 457. So, pretty crazy game that was definitely dominated by the 3 phonies early on. And that concludes the episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks to Matthew, Josh, and Jackson for always providing us with very entertaining content. And yeah, as always, feel free to leave any feedback in the comment section or any suggestions for other phonies or other players you think should be featured, and I'll be glad to make another one of these. So yeah, thanks again for watching, guys, and have a good one. Bye-bye.